Welcome to It's Not Just Business Talks with Sonja, where we get down to the real business of how great leaders dug through their own trenches and climbed some epic mountains to get where they are today. Now let's get started with the show.
I'm here today with Dr. Ted Anderson, who earned a BA in zoology from the University of Kansas and a PhD in biology from St. Louis University. I believe that sometimes that's pronounced St. Louis. Louis?
Yeah, St. Louis, the town.
His primary research interests have been on the community ecology and reproductive biology of the house sparrow. He taught for 32 years at McKendree University, retiring in 2004 as emeritus professor of biology. He also taught general ecology and biology of birds at the University of Michigan Biological Station and field ornithology at St. Louis University's Reese Biological Station. Is it Reese?
It's Rice, actually.
Rice, thank you. During sabbaticals in 1992 and 2000, he was a visiting scholar in Wolfson College, Oxford. And if that's not enough, he is the author of 2 books published by Oxford University Press: Biology of the Ubiquitous House Sparrow, From Genes to Populations, and The Life of David Lack, father of Evolutionary Ecology. In 2014, he wrote 53 weekly articles for the Bainbridge Islander entitled A Year of Birding in Bloedel. Okay, I'm exhausted. I think we can just go now.
I'm tired myself. Right?
Now, listen, may I call you Ted in this interview?
Certainly, absolutely.
Just to be clear, you definitely have earned Dr. Ted Anderson, but in light of keeping it simple, I do like Ted.
Yeah.
And it took me about 2 years to learn how to pronounce ubiquitous, or to even understand what that meant. Now, I've seen that book, and it's a large, very, very well written. It took me about 2 weeks to read the first page because I'm not of the academia kilt that you are. Let me see that book. Yes. So, but this was not a required work of yours. It was something that you did. Is that right? You elected?
That's right. I elected to do it. I had been contacted a few years before I began working on it by someone else, a biologist in Europe and Great Britain, who was planning to write this book, and he wanted reprints of my work. And I contacted him eventually because nothing happened, and he said, "Oh, I've had too many projects and I haven't." So in 1996, I set out to tackle it myself, and it took about 9 years to do it, but I'm really quite proud of it. I think it's
Absolutely
been very well received. So,
and utilized by academia everywhere, really.
Actually, throughout the world, because the sparrow pretty much occurs throughout the world on almost all inhabited areas of the world, in all continents except Antarctica, and so there are scientists working on it throughout the world.
That's brilliant. And your book is really as the resource of that. I mean, and after having taught 32 years, just correct me if I'm wrong, as in biology, did you teach specifically ornithology, or what were your?
Well, I taught at the time that I was at McKendree University. It was really a small college. So I taught a wide range of biology courses, from genetics to human anatomy and physiology, general ecology, morphology and development, as well as occasionally I taught ornithology.
Occasionally, the thing that you started that you love.
Right.
How did you find that one? I mean, it's such a, not even just the house sparrow, but just ornithology. It's just such a niche. How did you land on that? How did you discover that you love that?
Well, as a boy, I spent my summers on my grandparents' farm in central Kansas. Mm-hmm. My grandmother really introduced me to birds, and I got interested, and I just went from there. And it took me a while to figure that this was going to be my professional career as well as a personal interest. Matter of fact, I spent 5.5 years in the grain business after I
Oh, interesting.
left college before going back to get my PhD. And when I decided, well, really, I've only got one life to live, I really want to work on birds and and teach biology. So that's what happened.
Well, so that brings me to one of the fundamental questions I wanted to ask you. So you're a scientist.
Yes.
I admire and respect that deeply. And one thing that we've been talking about kind of on the side was you're also a man of faith. You're part of the Covenant Church. True?
Yes.
And I've read, and I'm probably going to misquote this, but there's a very small percentage of scientists who are also either religious or, a part of some organized faith. I would say less than 10%. Is that about right?
I don't really know. I know that there are a number of scientists who are people of faith, but there are probably, yes, many, many more who really are just devoted to the science, and partly because religion has so frequently attacked scientific findings, dating all the way back to Galileo and then to Charles Darwin, and because they find it a challenge to the way they understand the world. There's been a contentious relationship, I'd say, for a long time between religion and science.
Would you say, I was reflecting on that recently with COVID, and there are some certain groups that don't want to vaccinate for religious reasons, which is just a current day example of how religion and science don't mesh. But how do you reconcile the differences? How do you find space for both of those to be really important in your life?
Well, maybe I could start with a story.
Yes, please.
I had a retirement party when I retired from McKendree in 2004. And a number of my colleagues from the University of Michigan Biological Station came down for the party, and after the party, we went to somebody's house. There was a concert and dinner, and then we went to someone's house who had a piano, and Jack Gibbons played the piano some more and then we ended up at our house probably after midnight, and we were having drinks, and one of my colleagues from the University of Chicago, who I taught with for 15 years or more at the biostation, suddenly turned to me and said, "Ted, you're an evolutionary biologist. How can you be a Christian?" I had known him for 15 years, and he'd never posed a question like that. I never really talked about my religious faith.
Sure.
But he really nailed me. I was totally unprepared to answer.
Yeah.
I kind of stumbled through an answer that my faith was really about. Yes, I said I am a thoroughgoing evolutionary biologist.
Yes, right.
But I said my faith is about how we live together in relationship, and from marriage to all kinds of family and community relationships. That's what my faith is centered on, is relationship with people. And I thought it was a pretty inadequate answer. So after I retired, I started reading some popular theology, and I found one book that was really helpful for me in really articulating my own understanding of my faith. Because all along as a scientist, I had misgivings about things. I sometimes say to myself, "Ted, you don't really believe that, do you?" And I'm talking about some of the foundations, say, of the Christian faith, which is the faith that I'm associated with. And then, so this book by Marcus Borg.
Yep.
Really was helpful because he described faith as having 4 different manifestations in us. And he gave each of them a Latin name. That's what theologians do, I guess. Just like biologists, we're Homo sapiens after all. But one of the first one he talked about was a census, the Latin word, from which we get the idea of giving intellectual assent to something.
Okay.
And it was at that juncture really that my main issues came, was that I had difficulty giving intellectual assent to certain interpretations of the Bible, certain factual, so-called factual statements or historical statements in the Bible. These I found hard to believe.
Mm-hmm.
He said historically that was not the most important dimension of faith for humans. He said the most important faith, he gave three other names: fiducia, fidelia, and visio, meaning fiducia is trust. And it's what we put our trust in as we move forward in life. Whom do we trust? Where do we trust ourselves more than we trust some spiritual pulse or spiritual entity? And fidelia is faithfulness. And there it's a matter of how faithful we are to the commitments that we make. And visio is sort of the vision of the world. Is the world a negative place, a negative influence, or is it a positive dimension? And he said that makes a lot of difference in how we see things. That those are not intellectual constructs. Those are things that are metaphorically associated with what we call the soul or the heart. Our heart.
Yeah.
The heart is the symbol for love, and that's a metaphor because it's just really a big muscle. But we use that as a metaphor.
Sure. It is. This whole time I thought there was a whole space in there. No, just kidding.
Well, anyway, that was very helpful to me, because I thought, okay, I can live my life in these three dimensions of faith without having to feel that I've got to conform intellectually to certain propositions in Christianity, or for that matter, probably any other religion. No religion has a corner on an understanding of God. God is a construct that recognizes a spiritual dimension to life, to human life. And so those of us who grew up in a Christian tradition can find that meaning in the Christian tradition centered on the person of Jesus. And so anyway,
absolutely,
that's sort of the story that.
Well, let me digest that for a second.
Part of my journey. Pardon. Okay.
I want to digest that because I'm thinking about that for myself, right? So, first of all, I did not grow up in a Christian home, but I understood and felt whatever we want to call God, or you said the spiritual pulse, or that soul pulse. So I believe it's possible to be invited to that space without necessarily being from a Christian home. And so for me, then, of course, as soon as you learn some of the stories in the Bible, there's always questions. Why did Noah get on an ark? Is that even possible? Oh, no. The answer to that is no. But
and speaking here from the scientific point of view, no, there isn't enough water in the universe to cover the surface of the earth to the highest peak, so that everything. I mean, it's just it is a metaphorical story. It does have meaning, but it's not factually true.
And so
there probably was some kind of epic flood in the Middle East, because the Epic of Gilgamesh also describes a flood, another ancient text. But no, the Noah story is, in a sense, a very beautiful story with a lot of meaning, but we don't or I don't at least recognize it as factual.
And is that what you mean by intellectual assent?
Right.
Yes.
And
because
there are elements in the Christian church that are, conservative elements or fundamentalist elements or literalists who want to take the Bible and somehow assert that it's entirely factual or true. And I find that basically impossible.
I think it's one of the roadblocks that somebody new to Christianity could face. And I certainly faced it. And that is, if you give me a book and there's, I'm just making this up arbitrarily, but 100 facts, and I read the first 3 and they are completely, to me, just not even possible, I'm going to throw the other 97 out as well, right? Because it just doesn't intellectually resonate with me. And so, and I couldn't accept parts of some of the information and not the others, like cherry picking what to align with. And so how do you overcome, so you can enjoy certain parts of the beautiful metaphor as in Noah and the ark, but other less conservative Christians might still say, yes, but the 10 commandments still stand. Noah doesn't stand, but the 10 commandments stand. How do Christians figure out which parts they're going to stand behind and enforce and decide, you can't be gay or you can't be, where's that line and how do they find it?
Well, it's that's a part of the problem of contemporary Christianity is that particularly in the common understanding of Christianity, Christianity is expressed as things that Christians are against.
Mm-hmm.
Negative. They're opposed to abortion. They're opposed to gay rights. They're opposed to evolution. They're opposed. It's defined in terms of a negative. And it's one reason why I find it hard to even call myself a Christian anymore, because I don't want to be defined in that way. I've come to call myself a Jesus follower, because actually I should say that for a number of years I was an agnostic myself, or atheist, somewhere an agnostic atheist. And when I came back to faith, I just concentrated on reading the Jesus story, the Gospels. And one of the times that I read them through, I just said to myself, well, what does Jesus ask of people in terms of, and the most common thing that he asked people was simply follow me, follow me. And the Jesus story is the center of the Christian Bible. And the important things that we need, as in my view, to look at are what Jesus would do, what Jesus taught, and that's where I've tried to place my trust rather than in myself. This is one reason I came back to faith, because I had realized that one of the reasons I wasn't interested in faith was that I was going to do it myself and I was going to be fine. And I think that's always a temptation for all of us. We all think we can be in charge and do great. And then as I went along that path for a while, I began to realize I'm not doing so great. And so by placing my trust in Jesus and trying to follow what he taught and did, it put a whole different spin on my life.
Sure.
And so I don't have to believe all these things that I find impossible to believe to be a Jesus follower. At least that's the way I have. That's the reconciliation that I've made between science and religion. Science is an extremely powerful mode of explanation. It has been, I think, probably, in my view, the most successful human endeavor in history, and the modern scientific age began all the way back in the late medieval period and flourished in the Renaissance and then in the Enlightenment. And it has been an extremely powerful way of understanding
Absolutely
the world. And but the only problem is that science really does not admit a spiritual reality into its explanatory system. Science operates with certain rules that are based on presuppositions that they make about the nature of reality. And one of those presuppositions is basically that the material world is all
that there is.
All that there is in terms of scientific explanation. And that's a metaphysical statement. It's not something that can be proved. You can't prove that. Either way. You also can't prove that there's a spiritual reality. Those are metaphysical conclusions, and science is based on that conclusion and attempts, therefore, to explain all natural phenomena naturalistically. But science in the early 20th century, getting into, do you want to talk a little philosophy of science?
I love it. I'll invite you to. Yes, please.
Well, I did teach some seminars at the University of Michigan Biological Station on philosophy of science. And I concentrated on the 20th century because that's where most of the philosophy of science developed. And early in the century, and the philosophy that really had hegemony in the philosophical world was what was called logical positivism. And the logical positivists said that empirical observation plus deductive logic was how science operated, and that by doing so, it could give us objective knowledge. Well, that turned out not to be so easily demonstrated. As a matter of fact, there was a lot of eventual pushback to that idea. But so what science was claiming was that it was the only way to real truth about the natural world.
Got it. Yeah.
But, the interesting thing that I've been thinking about is that the science that is developed around COVID has demonstrated how science really operates. We have a novel coronavirus.
Right.
Science begins to work on trying to understand that because it's a tremendous human health risk. And if you look at the history of what they've done in the last few, first we were washing our hands.
Yep.
And singing happy birthday twice while doing so with soap. Because,
that's what we had.
We envisioned that one of the main means of transmission of it was by picking it up off of surfaces and then touching our face. Well, that turned out really not to be the case. That's a rare form of transmission. It's an aerial. Oh, here I'm having trouble.
Yeah, try it again. I couldn't say it.
Aerial-sized particles that actually are taken directly into the respiratory system. And that's the primary mode. So initially, I think Fauci said, well, masks probably aren't much help. And then all of a sudden, masks are really important, and we're still using masks. And so science takes the information that it has, and it does the best that it can. And with that information, and as more information comes along, science changes and can change its conclusions. And what I say about science relative to what the positivists had to say was science gives us provisional knowledge, not objective knowledge. The knowledge that it gives us is based on objectivity, but it does not give us objective knowledge. it gives us the best provisional knowledge available right now.
Today, yeah.
And as we learn more, we have to change those.
Absolutely.
And so science is really, and our best understanding of the universe that we've got. But it's going to change. It's what we have right now is not going to be the same as our understanding 10 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now. Science continues to develop a better and better understanding of the universe and natural phenomena.
So if I spin that around a little bit, thank you for that. If I jump back into this topic of one way that you reconciled Christianity was to isolate or really invest energy into following the Jesus story. Follow me, follow Jesus. And how did Jesus exist in the world as we know it? And if you read those stories, they're actually, I actually 100% agree with you on that. He did a lot of things that some of our Christian friends don't do, such as feed the poor, love the sick, love thy neighbor, things that we really actually, if we follow Jesus, could have a very beautiful, less divisive life. However, do you think by just doing that alone, so you mentioned how science is provisional, the information that you're getting is provisional, and so the trick here is being able to ask the question, right? But for me, what I understood about Jesus when I was 15 versus what I understand now has matured. But the Bible and what has been written in the Gospels hasn't changed since I was 15 versus now. It's that I have changed, right? Whereas in science, information changes, and your provisional information changes.
Knowledge changes with.
Yeah, right. So the Bible has actually not changed, and yet I have changed because of acting on information in that. How did you understand the kind of the twisted question in there, which is, it's almost like maybe that's part of the spiritual realm of that, is that it affects us, right? We're the ones that change, not the content.
Yes, I would agree. I mean, the canon, the canon that was decided upon in Nicaea in the 4th century, that we call the Bible, the Christian Bible, doesn't change and hasn't changed since then, basically. But the stories are, because they're largely metaphorical. Jesus taught in metaphor.
Mm-hmm.
He taught in parables. That was his primary mode of teaching, was not to tell people what to do, but to tell a story that called on them to acknowledge something in their own life or get a new insight. Or the most beautiful story for me in the Bible is the story that he told about the Good Samaritan. Excuse me. This lawyer comes to him and says, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" He started with, "What's the greatest commandment?" And Jesus said, "Well, how do you read it?" And he said, "Thou shalt love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And Jesus said, "Well, you've got it. You've got it. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
All you have to do is do that, and you're okay."
Mm-hmm.
So the lawyer persists, though, because his question then is, who's my neighbor? Which is what we all have to ask. Who is a neighbor that we're called on to love? And Jesus tells a story. He doesn't answer the question. He tells a story. The guy is apparently a merchant of some kind, and he's taking the dangerous road between Jerusalem and Jericho. And he gets hit upon by thieves who beat him up, take everything, and leave him for dead. And a priest walks by and doesn't even look at him. And then another church official, or not church, temple official in that story, of course, because it was Jewish, temple official walks by and he goes over and takes a look at him, but he walks on too. And then the Samaritan, who is the equivalent of, for the Jews of that time, as the most hated group of people. And, you know, in their immediate circle, comes along, binds up his wounds, and hauls him to a motel and tells him, he leaves money for the motel keeper to take care of him, and says, when I come back this way, I'll repay you if you have to pay more than I've given you. So that's the story. And Jesus then turns to the lawyer and he said, so who in this story is the neighbor? And the guy had to say, well, the guy, he didn't even say Samaritan, I don't think, the way the story is recorded. Well, the guy who helped him go and do likewise. So that's a story that it's a lot about ourselves, and about what our place in the world is, and what we should be doing as people.
And I think as you do those things, which hopefully to many people is instinctive, but if so this could be true even if you weren't Christian or didn't read the Bible or didn't, know or, Jesus, but literally if you follow me or follow Jesus and do just those things, then I do think there's a certain spiritual maturity that comes over many years as we discover ourselves doing and acting in ways that might not have been instinctive, and we're learning how to do those things.
Yeah, and this is, I'm not at all. Well, I don't believe that Christians can assert that this is the only way to live life. There are many other great spiritual teachers. They've been throughout history who tapped into whatever this is that we call spirituality. Jesus at one point to the woman at the well, he said, God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. So this spirit is something that there are all kinds of metaphors for, I think, in the history of human existence. And somehow it's been an impulse in virtually every society.
Yeah.
Recognize some kind of a spiritual dimension to life. And that lies outside of the realm of scientific explanation, because scientific explanation really depends, like I said, on those presuppositions that essentially set any possibility of a spiritual causal event aside. Doesn't recognize such things.
Do you have to have two buckets in your head? There's one for science and one for spirituality, or do you have a way that they sort of meld like melted butter, or do they not?
No, I do not. I'm more the latter. I hold two perspectives on life, which are, I think, almost irreconcilable, in some kind of tension. But I think it's a productive tension. It's not a destructive. It's not necessarily, I should say, a destructive tension. Living with ambiguity is something that we all have to do. We can't be certain.
Right.
And so all of us have to live with a certain amount of ambiguity in our lives. And I guess, accept that. And I certainly accept the fact that things that rely really on a spiritual dimension of some kind, like love, truth, justice, free will, even. Scientific explanation envisions a mechanistic universe, and things are determined mechanistically in that universe and deterministically. So at least in their scientific explanation, when you extend that to all of life, then you are dealing with what I call philosophical materialism. You are just saying there is no chance that there is anything spiritual in the universe. And that's, I think, where a lot of modern culture finds itself, at least living in a scientific age in which we've come to accept science as such a powerful entity that we accept its premises as well as its conclusions.
Not having room for basically, like you said, intellectual assent, just throwing the baby out with the bathwater because there's just too much information in there that doesn't resonate. And so it can't be true. Science must be true. There are waning number of people, particularly in Europe, where that have an interest in church as much as before, because they can't reconcile. They can't, like you said, sit in the tension between these two spaces with some ambiguity. But I would argue that most people, if pressed, would say they have or do feel some sort of spiritual or some sort of essence beyond themselves. I think most people, even if they can't put a finger on it, would have to recognize that, and that doesn't align with science as you just defined it for everybody. So that's just the nature of that. Well, Ted, it's been awesome to have a chance to interview you on this topic. I really appreciate it. Appreciate you taking the time. And I'm going to, because I know people will be interested in the Ubiquitous House Sparrow. I will warn you, it's an intellectual read, and I was not smart enough to get past page. But it's fascinating. And also, I've had the privilege of being with Ted when he can identify birds simply by their song, no matter how far away they are. Very, very excellent skill on that front. I've learned how to, I've got the chickadee down.
Good.
That's just the one bird. Yep, that's how I learned it, because Todd would say, just listen, chickadee, dee, 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 dee. Well, thank you so much. And I will put some links to these books because I think they're fantastic, and I appreciate you joining me in this rainy Pacific Northwest day.
Yeah, it certainly is. Well, thank you, Sonja.
Thanks for listening to It's Not Just Business Talks with Sonja, a real-life podcast to inspire you. We'll see you again next time, and if this is your jam, click subscribe to get future episodes.